Florida came about for me because I started spending a lot of time in Florida about 20 years ago. And for whatever reason, you know, South Florida seems to either draw people in really strongly or just
repel them.
Yes. And I was one of those people who felt immediately at home there. And when I leave, I feel as if I've left home. And when I arrive and the plane lets down, I feel as if my own wings have let down. I love South Florida. I love the diversity. I love Cuban coffee. I love Cuban food. I love the air. I have stayed in Fort Lauderdale without air conditioning in August. I have been on a Florida porch with the lights turned out and heard rustling around me and turned on the lights to find myself surrounded by palmetto bugs. I have experienced everything negative about South Florida, I think, except a hurricane. And none of that discourages me. For some reason, that's just my psychic home.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
I felt that way coming from the Midwest to the desert.
I was thinking about that as I was here today, thinking how, as much as I like this area, it doesn't pull me the way South Florida does, but that I know people who feel exactly the same way about the desert as I feel about South Florida.
Right, and I'm one of those repelled by South Florida,
Yeah,
so it's interesting how different things call to you. Or,
call to you,
know.
that's right. I also think that metaphorically, South Florida is the right state for this particular series because, as we talked about, this is a series that deals with the surface facts and then the truth behind the surface facts. And that's the way I see Florida. I see Florida, I can see Florida through the eyes of people who don't like it, and I can see that they see tackiness and glitter and maybe they see suburbs covering everything and it looks unpleasant to them. But I am fascinated by Florida from top to bottom, and I know that even such things as the fact that the state is built on porous limestone, and there's water down there that the sunshine has not warmed in centuries, and there are caverns, and there are bears, and there are panthers, and there are alligators. It's one of the 3 most geographically diverse states in the Union. And I guess what I'm saying is that I think that there are all sorts of shadows and caverns and secret places in Florida that that are hidden by this surface. And so you have the surface facts of Florida, and then you have a whole lot of dramatic depth underneath. And I think that fits the series.
Well, it does. And of course, when you have this much diversity, you also have enormous conflict.
That's right.
I mean, the Southwest is very much like that. You know, there's an interface of different cultures, different races.
That's
and,
true.
you know, it's a different mix. I mean, here, you know, you have a large Hispanic and you have a large Indian, and you know, you have the Anglos who've come in and you know are annoying to both. You have a serious Oriental population, you know, brought in really from the railroads and now from other things. You know, California, of course, has become, you know, diversity central.
Right.
And I think whenever you have those mixes, you get more interesting possibilities for
I
a
think so
crime
too.
novel. I mean, you know,
Absolutely.
you're going to have probably less in Kansas,
Yeah.
which is still, I suspect, more homogenous.
Yes, it is.
I'm
Although
just
there's-
guessing, although there has to be by now a serious, I mean, everywhere is diversifying.
Yeah, the Kansas City area is still, unfortunately, very segregated, and so there's plenty of room for conflict if I wanted to do it there. There's a possibility of there's diversity that hasn't become diverse, you might say. And in Florida, I can't say so far that I have, in my books, used the diversity as a basis for the conflict in the books. I've used other things, but of course there's always the background of that, and I think that kind of diversity has to be in the back of the minds of anybody who reads a book set in South Florida too, even as if that particular story doesn't deal with those diverse populations.
This is true, but at least in Ring of Truth, though, you do have a chance to play upon the idea that people who go to a state like Florida, Arizona, or California, which is kind of vacation land, retirement land, at the end of the line, so to speak, they get to reinvent themselves. They get to come there with their own stories, and they may not be true stories.
Yeah.
And certainly Ring of Truth abounds with people who, you know, whose
are not what they
stories
seem.
Exactly. And there's always been that in certainly in California mysteries, but I think here in Phoenix, in fact, you don't know when you meet someone, you know, if they are really who they purport to be, because they may well have come from somewhere else. And you don't have those old families, old roots. It's not like Charleston or New Orleans or, you know, Boston or one of those cities, or even San Francisco in the days of yore, where, you know, there were old families and people kind of knew who, you know,
That's right.
who everybody was. You had connections that were obvious to the community. And in smaller communities, they kind of had to keep you even if they didn't like the way you behaved. So I thought in Ring of Truth, all that really played in.
I was talking to a friend of mine who lives in Tucson, and actually she's in Ring of Truth. At the beginning of Ring of Truth, there are two little girls who discover a body, and those two little girls are my old friend Linda and me.
Ah.
And Linda is Jenny, and I'm Nikki. Physically, it's not a description of us, but that's very much a description of how we were when we were kids, although we didn't meet till we were 14 years old. But she was very much the one who went ahead, past the no trespassing signs, and was pulling more timid me along. But I was also the one who did everything she did and never got blamed for it. So she gets a kick out of seeing what I've done with that. But she was saying to me that when she read the book, what it got her to thinking about was all the times in her life when she was thinking about how people were not as they necessarily what she thought they were, and
You bet.
and people were not as they seem.
And it's easier, as I
Yeah.
said, in a place like that. In the whole truth, you also took advantage of those canals, that kind
Yes.
of waterway system that I assume it's Fort Lauderdale.
Yes, it is.
And that was really the raison d'etre for the crime, for the book getting started, was a crime committed in a unique way on the waterway.
Yeah, and again, this is the first time in a series I've ever used any characters, except one or two exceptions, who were based on real people I know. But again, that book also started out with two people who are dear friends of mine. There are a married couple in a boat on the canals, and those are friends of mine in Fort Lauderdale. And that's their boat, and I have been on that boat, and I have gone under those bridges, and that's how I could write about it with a sense of reality, because I've done that. That's part of the fascination for me of Florida, the fact that instead of streets there are canals, and in the middle of the most pristine, beautiful residential areas with palm trees and canals, just a block or two away there may be some hardwood forest, a place where there are no trespassing signs, and a dark place in the road, and maybe an old mansion falling down inside. The mansion, in fact, and the property in Ring of Truth is a place where I have been, and it's the house where Body Heat was filmed. But that house has actually been torn down. It no longer exists. But T.J. McGregor, another mystery and suspense writer, and I went over the no trespassing signs down the long driveway up to look at the house, and when I saw that I thought, this is going to be in some book I write at some time. And those little hidden places are all over Florida.
I'm sure they are, but I was also thinking in the whole truth that it meant that in a community which is, substantial, pristine, safe, etc., because of the waterways, there can be passage of all sorts
yes.
of darker creatures, right through it without anybody really ever being aware of it.
Of course, Barbara, really that's true with streets. I mean, all sorts of people can drive down our streets, and we have no idea who goes past at any given time. I think it seems more dramatic because it's water and it's something different, and because the water has a depth that the streets don't have, so there literally could be creatures, not just human beings on boats, but creatures.
Well, that's what I was thinking. You could have slithering out creatures as well as evil.
Right.
And then you did a rather daring thing, which was that you killed off a child.
Yeah, it was, I guess it was daring, but it was really necessary for readers to really hate the villain of that story in order to make what happened next in the story emotionally affect them emotionally. And I can't talk about it more for fear of spoiling the story. And what I did, since a child died in the story, what I did was do my best not to sensationalize it. And what I have found in terms of people who hesitate to read stories about children who are hurt is, so far I haven't run across anybody who says, boy, did you sensationalize that. Instead, I've run across people who say, well, I hesitated to read that, but when I read it, it was okay. And eventually they forgot their initial hesitation about it. Sometimes as a writer, you just have to write what you have to write.
Well, I certainly agree with you that for the story to work, it needed to go that way. But
yeah.
nonetheless, that is a dramatic change, let's say, from the Jenny Kane series, which was a much lighter.
Yeah.
The focus of it was different. And are you pleased with the terrific critical reception that you've had for The Whole Truth?
I'm very pleased. It's wonderful when you start something new to then have it received well. So you bet. I'm very pleased about that.